Andor Season 2 is extraordinary television, and they absolutely stuck the landing. But I got to admit, I have a very specific problem in regards to these three final episodes. And my problem specifically relates to the fact that these are the three final episodes. What kind of lunatic would end such a perfect show? I ask you, why? Howdy. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insight into the creative process of storytelling. And okay, I can tell you why. Because there's actually a movie you could watch right after these three episodes, and the story just keeps going. And as we all know, Cassian Andor lives happily ever after. But speaking of happy things, today's guest is screenwriter Tom Bissell. He wrote the final three episodes, and this is not the end of Andor coverage in this podcast, because I am pleased to announce that we will have Tony Gilroy with us next week to recap pretty much the rest of the season, since when his first interview left off, kind of going in and out of things that we've talked about a little with some of the other writers, but getting Tony's unique take on it because he also was rewriting them, and I'm sure has a few things to say. So there's a little more Andor still left for us to discuss. But today's chat with Tom Bissell was a lot of fun. And Tom is a very insightful writer. You could tell just how much research he did and how much these characters and the storyline meant to Tom. And without a doubt, he was very forthcoming about his creative process. So I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine. We've turned 13 this year, and we couldn't have done it without you. Heck, it's even my 20th year of podcasting. So there's a lot of anniversaries going on. I guess there's an anniversary every year, though, if you count them. But look, if you've never read us before, you could read Backstory over at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop, or on our iPad app, Backstory. There's a free issue just sitting there waiting for you to check out. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. We always update each issue right up until we publish the next issue with new articles. So that's something cool that's going on as well. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could find all these Zoom casts. That's right. So today you could watch Tom and I on Zoom having a good chat. I got to say, it would really mean a lot to me to have you support independent entertainment journalism. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now let's jump right into our interview with screenwriter Tom Bissell as we chat about the final three episodes. That's right. Episodes 10 through 12 of Andor Season 2, which you could watch right now on Disney+. Tom, it's good to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I've been watching these episodes and reliving the wild days of 2022 in the Andor writers' room. So it's been really fun. I'm delighted to be here.
We're very happy to have you, and it's going to be great to kind of see it from your perspective of what the writers' room was like. But before we get there, I just want to kind of introduce our listeners to you. You have experience with other people's intellectual property, which is technically the assignment here. Tell us, what, if anything, have you learned as a writer from kind of experimenting with someone else's original IP, but still making it your own, which is really the core of the assignment here?
My real start was writing books. I was a book writer for a decade and a half, and then drifted into game writing, and then drifted into, screenwriting. You're right to intuit that working in games, you're constantly working with other people's IPs, which all have their own weird rules. And I'll just bring it to something that Tony said to me when we were starting on season 2. I can't say it was anything I'd ever put into words as well as he did, but it was kind of a principle that I'd maybe been subconsciously aware of going through my, time writing for like Uncharted or Gears of War or Battlefield or any of these games. Tony said something I thought was really great. He said, a lot of times when you're working on IP storytelling, your impulse is to open the toy box and start playing with all the toys. And he said, what you should try to resist that. And what you should do is leave more toys in the toy box than were there when you got there, and resisting the impulse to be a child and instead think more like a storyteller who's adding to the world rather than taking from it. When I think of just the avalanche of new ideas and materials and planets and concepts that these two seasons of Andor have injected into Star Wars. I can't think of a stronger endorsement for that approach to working in IP storytelling, which doesn't mean you're not mindful of canon, which doesn't mean you're not mindful of fans and stuff like that. But I think if your primary goal is to make fans happy, you're going to be in trouble real quick.
That's perfect advice, because there were a lot of inventions that came out of both seasons of Andor that I think will have people curious about for years. And there's a few places that I could see other narratives returning to, kind of branching out to the side. So that's perfect advice. And your writing led to the movie The Disaster Artist, based on your book that you co-wrote, based on Tommy Wiseau's film The Room. Incredible book, incredible film. It must have been a great experience for you. I know you didn't write the screenplay for the movie, but it was based on your book. Was there something that either really surprised you about the translation to the screen because you got to see your own work adapted, or was there something that you secretly had wished made it out of the pages of the book to the screen that didn't, that you want to tell us about? I absolutely love it. We'll just stay on it briefly because I want to bring it to people's attention.
I've had 3 films made of stuff that I've written, two of my short stories, and The Disaster Artist. And I have a real church and state view of this. Like, the thing that I wrote is my thing, and the thing that people go and make is their thing. So I just don't have any vested interest in like whether it's good or not, because it's their thing. Like, I hope it's good, but if it's not, like, well, I didn't have anything to do with it, you know. Right. And if it's bad, I can still take all the credit. So it's a wonderful bargain I made with myself. No, to be serious, I really just wish filmmakers well if they're embarking on something that, you know, originated with me. Sure. I try not to get emotional about it. It's their thing. Once you sign the rights, you are forsaking ownership of the thing that they're going to make. You know, I've asked if I've ever wanted to adapt anything I wrote myself, and I always say no. And the thing I always say is dentists don't give themselves root canals. I would not want to adapt myself. It's such a radically different form that some people are brilliant adapters of their own work, but I don't even want to find out if I'm good at that or not. I'd rather, you know, adapt other people's stuff. It's a lot less painful.
It keeps your creative juices flowing because you're creating new stuff rather than returning to stuff that you've already settled. So that makes sense as well. You know, obviously, I think the way to incorporate this into Andor is your first major television experience that I know of was Mosquito Coast, based on a film that I absolutely adore. It's so wild that you were able to even get someone to greenlit a TV series based on the Mosquito Coast, because the source material is just so not exactly what you would expect to find on TV, but I'm glad that it was on TV. And that would be the first writer's room for television that I know of that you were in. And please correct me if there was another one. And I'm just curious about how you could compare that experience to the way that Tony Gilroy led the writer's room for Andor.
I've been in a bunch of writer's rooms for shows that you've not seen or that didn't happen, and games that, you know, have come out. So I've been in a fair number of them. There's no comparison to the Andor writer's room. I've never been in a more like supercharged environment than that. It was 3 of the best screenwriters we have and me in that room, and how quickly they worked, the shorthand they'd already developed with each other. And Tony's decisiveness is the thing that I really came to appreciate. Every project I have been on that has gotten into trouble, the most typical common denominator is indecisiveness from the top. And that just allows departments to spin out. When creative leads are not making creative decisions that are giving guidance to the rest of the team, that's when projects begin to like go oblong and drift out of their proper orbit. And Tony's just not like that. Like, the thing that he says when you land on something and you've got it, he's like, okay, that's a movie scene, even though you're writing a TV show. He's like, that's a movie scene. That's his stamp of approval. And whenever you heard that's a movie scene, we moved on. Man, like, I've heard people being in writers' rooms for 8-9 months for a 6 to 10 episode series. I just do not know what people are doing all that time. Like, I guess they're getting somewhere good, like a lot of great shows. I know that the Damon Lindelof Watchmen show, that was a hugely long writer's room, and that show is phenomenally good. So obviously it bears fruit sometimes, but I don't think it needs to be that long all the time. And working with Tony led me to believe that coming in prepared with people who know what they're doing, you can do a lot in a very short period of time.
I love Watchmen. And you know, a lot of it is discovery, going down trails that you realize you need to return and go back to the trailhead and start over. So like having the luxury to do that, I think is also how sometimes the time ticks away, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it. How did you get the gig? How were you invited into the season 2 Andor writers room?
So when I joined the WGA, it was that weird period where nobody had agents because they fired them all over packaging concerns. I spent my first 6 years as a professional screenwriter. I just had a manager and I had a lawyer. Both of them are awesome and I love them. But, you get curb stomped a few times and you think, maybe I do need an agent. Maybe I need more people in my corner. So I did the tour of the town, visited CAA and UTA and WME and was talking to people representing me. And my first meeting with CAA, so a wonderful agent there named Tiffany Ward, who is Tony's agent. And we've been talking for a while. And she said, "Are you a Tony Gilroy fan by any chance?" And I said, "Well, I think he's probably one of the greatest living screenwriters. So yes, I'm a Tony Gilroy fan." She said, "Are you a Star Wars fan?" And I knew instantly what they were talking about because I knew that Andor just wrapped like 3 or 4 months before that. I was very eager to see it. And when she said that, I thought, well, okay, well, that's the most agenty thing that it ever agented. Like this is not going to happen. But she said, "I bet you guys would like each other." And Tiffany was true to her word. She has since become my agent. And 5 days later, I think I was on a Zoom call with Tony and we talked for like 2 hours. We didn't talk about Star Wars. We didn't talk about screenwriting thoughts. We mostly talked about historical insurgencies. Like I had some background in it. In 2005, I did a piece about the Iraq War for Harper's, embedded with the Marine Corps, about how to fight insurgencies. And I wrote a book about the Vietnam War. So a lot of insurgency historical research I did on that. So Tony and I spent probably an hour and a half of our 2 hours talking about like Mao's march across China and the Gun and early Israel and the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh and like just historical insurgencies. And talking to him, I was realizing, my God, like because I hadn't seen the show yet, right? This is a while before there was even a cut of it. Just hearing him talk about what he wanted to do, I remember thinking, well, this is either going to be a work of like something truly special or it's going to be just utter madness. Like, how can you do this in Star Wars? I didn't know yet. Nobody knew yet.
Right.
Nobody knew yet what you could do. I think at the end of the call, he said something, said, "Do you want to do this or not?" And I was like, "You'll have me, I'm in." And that was how it happened.
Tony's fantastic. We've done these previous episodes with the other writers and they've described the writing room. And from what everybody said, and I want to hear you build on this consensus, essentially for season 2, you guys gathered in the fall of 2022 and you had what seems like an incredibly short amount of time to break the season. It seems like Tony said he doubled his time from season 1 to season 2. So you had a little over 2 weeks, if I'm clocking that right.
We had 9 days.
9 days. Okay.
But one of them, Kathy, came and visited us. So we wound up talking to her for a while. So it was kind of a half day. So 8.5 days. Yeah.
At that point, Tony had walked in with a very solid Bible that he said he was open to changing. And so he described you as the kid that always does his homework. He said that like you were the kid in class that would sometimes raise his hand first. And I want to hear about that. Like, obviously, it is overwhelming to come into the Star Wars universe and have to have somewhat of a sense of canon, even though everybody's always said that Lucasfilm was great about providing whatever gaps you needed and figuring out what characters and places you could visit at that point in the timeline. But what was it like for you to come in as the outsider to season 2 and to kind of get that grasp of lore that you wanted to embed a little bit into some of your writing?
I mean, the first couple of days are pretty intense. You have 2 guys who are brothers, and Bo and Tony, first had a mentor-mentee relationship, but then Bo hired Tony to help. Like, I was just this stranger walking into this. They were very welcoming and very cool about it, but I didn't do a lot of talking for the first day or 2. I was just listening. I was just trying to learn and figure stuff out. And I remember walking away from the Soho Grand Hotel after day 1, and I called Tiffany, Tony's my agent, and I said, "I feel like a kid that averaged like 18.5 points a game at like the Ohio State University's junior and senior year of school. And now I'm on the floor with the 85 Lakers." That's what it felt like. It is testament to their generosity and their general level of chill that is as heated as the room got. It was a rough room, but it was never a mean room. I just tried to contribute where I could. And I took a lot of notes. And I think the most interesting thing that happened, and Jeff, this will probably be interesting to people in the audience, because screenwriters and aspiring screenwriters, this kind of dropped a neutron bomb in my head about storytelling. I was pitching something and I wasn't getting a lot of traction, and I kept going back to this thing I was trying to pitch. And Tony finally turned to me and he said, "Hey, you just got to stop pitching plot. Plot is bullshit." And this is the thing he said. He said, "Plot is what happens when you get the behavior right." He said, "Pitch me a line of dialogue, pitch me atmosphere, pitch me something visual. Stop pitching stuff that happens. Anyone can come up with a bunch of quote unquote interesting things that happen in sequence. But if there's no like emotional undercurrent, if there's nothing holding it up, it's just empty spectacle." Coming out of video games where just spectacle is, the coin of the realm.
Yeah.
In many cases, it really made me realize that plot is what happens when you get the behavior right. The plot kind of takes care of itself. It really does. If the people are doing the things, they're doing truthful things and they're doing things that tie into the thematics of your show, the plot is going to take care of itself. I never worry about plot anymore. I worry about the behavior and I worry about the people, and the rest takes care of itself typically. So that was a real breakthrough I had on like day 2 of the writer's room. And I learned more from those 3 gentlemen in 9 days than I'd learned on my own in the previous 6 years.
We have so much to get to for these 3 episodes, but I do want to just say that you're right. I mean, like, you really just nailed what people love about Tony's writing and also what people love about Andor in general. It is character driven and emotionally charged. And those are the 2 things that you could really say about Andor. And of course, the plot fits in perfectly to the Star Wars universe. But it's a very tough thing to do that in writing because, especially in the outlining stage, writers have a very chicken versus the egg sentimentality about which comes first, the character or the plot, because they both are a feedback loop where they inform each other. And so you would think that your outline is plot driven, but at the same time, if you know that you want a character to feel burnt out at a certain point and you pin that on the wall, you could write to that. And that's emotional driven writing. So it's confusing, but I would be willing to bet you, even having had Tony say that, he's so organized that he still came in with a plot driven Bible for season 2 that, yes, had emotional character beats incorporated into it, but there's no way Tony just showed up with a book of vibes.
No,
I know him well enough to know that as well.
There were narrative buoys throughout. Yeah. It was swimming from buoy to buoy and figuring out interesting character beats in between those buoys.
Sure.
That's how I would put it. And his outline was really interesting because it flies at like 75,000 feet and then it like drops to like 5 feet. And then you're just in like this atomically precise moment and then it zooms back out. And it kind of hovers and pounces. I mean, a lot changed. It was a great outline. It was a rip-roaring yarn to read.
We're going to get into that in the spoilers in just a second because we're moving so fast that we're going to have to hit the spoilers fast. But before we do, I want to talk about your creative habit. To my knowledge, once you guys were done with your 9 days, Tony then gave each writer the assignment, okay, go off and do the first draft of your batch of episodes. You ended up with the finale, which is, no pressure whatsoever. You got to bring this 2-season show to a close. So yeah, that's easy. What were you thinking about that part of your assignment? And then tell us how long you had to turn in those 3 scripts.
I think Tony mentioned that I had the most rewriting to do of all of the, and his thing. And I think he's talking about 210 was the one that he took the whacking stick to early on. It was pretty much a page 1. No, not quite a page 1. There was some stuff that sort of lingered, but I was feeling my way into the tone, right? And I wanted it to feel congruent with a bunch of episodes that hadn't even been written yet, mind you. This is the weird thing. I think 5 days after I got home, I had drafts of all 3 of my episodes. And I was so embarrassed to send them because I'd worked so quickly because, I was in New York. I was going home and like sketching stuff that we talked about that day. I was like writing throughout my 2 weeks in New York. So by the time I got home, I had a bunch of scenes and things I was thinking about. Some of those scenes we can talk about. So I waited then another 10 days of just tweaking and fiddling and sent them to Tony. And 210 was the one he really focused on. And he gave me some just really great thoughts about how to rethink the way I was staging some of the scenes. And the way, the advice he gave, it's pretty much the way you're seeing the scenes in 210. Once he gave me that first kind of bastonado whack, something clicked. And I was like, okay, I know what he wants. Because look, on a show like this, your job is to carry the ball as far down the field as you can. Tony's going to carry it into the end zone. With Bo and Danny and me, he's going to score the touchdown. You're trying to get it to the 70, 80, maybe even the 90-yard line. You're trying to make his job as easy as possible at the end.
Right.
Because a ton of stuff slips after you're off the project, right? A ton of stuff slips. So for example, in 210, there was a sequence that I wrote that was pegged to a specific location that Luke Hall and I had sort of planned a big part of this. It's a kind of incursion sequence. And he showed me the photos of the location he'd scouted, was really hoping he'd get it. And I wrote a bunch of sequences specifically to this location. We didn't get a location. Tony had to come in and like rethink some of the stuff in there. And I think actually he just cut most of it, which wound up like just being helpful. It's a much simpler sequence now. But like stuff like that happens. And, you know, I do not envy Tony for just the amount of stuff he was juggling, you know, cruising right up to full production. And then, you know, throughout production, because the blocks are shot individually and he's finalizing everything. So when you call that man in the middle of a busy time for him, you can hear the tensile stress in his voice. The guy's a pro. What can I say?
How long, once he had you do the rewrites, were you rewriting those scripts for it? 3 scripts in 5 days.
Yeah. And then I spent like 2 months doing them. And then, you know, you get 3 goes. You get your first draft, you get your rewrite, and then you get your polish. I turned in all 3 of my scripts, I think 7 days before season 1 aired. It's important to remember that this season was written, at least my part was written in a vacuum from what the reception was going to be. No one knew. We didn't know. We did not know. I don't think anyone knew. I don't think Lucasfilm
But you
knew.
had obviously read all the scripts for season 1.
Of course. So, yeah, I'd seen them all. And
you had seen the cuts. Yeah.
I knew it was spectacular. I think everyone on our side, I think, knew this was a spectacular show. Was it going to be embraced? Was, I think, the question. And thank God it was.
Just a brief thing about your writing. When you sit down to write, what's more important to you? A certain amount of hours that you spend writing each day in your habit, or a certain amount of pages as a goal?
I write until I feel I can't do it anymore. Ernest Hemingway counted his words that he wrote a day. He also shot himself at the age of 63. I learned long ago to be a page monger and a word count monger. It just leads you to places of despair, because if you write one great paragraph, that's going to leave you feeling better than like 7 sprawling, messy pages that you're going to have to completely rewrite. So I write until it stops feeling good, and then I call it a day. Sometimes that's 6 or 7 hours. Some days it's 2. It really just depends.
Well, we are going to get into the spoiler section. So, folks, if you have not yet seen the final batch of Andor Season 2 on Disney Plus, episodes 10 through 12, press pause.
Shame on you.
It's okay. Press pause. Go watch it on Disney Plus, and then come on back to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or our YouTube page, which is the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see us in these Zoomcasts, and you could see the books on the wall right behind Tom and his nice sport coat. I feel underdressed suddenly. You could see us in the Zoomcast because we are now going to get into the spoilers. You have been so warned. Tell us about this sequence that was cut from episode 10.
Leia's incursion into the hospital to kill Luthen. Now remember, this is before Luthen had become Luthen in the popular imagination. But even then, I was deeply aware that I had the privilege to write this sequence of a character that I'd come to love over the first season, and was thrilled to see her get such standout, treatment in the room, and just what we were planning for her. And this is her like standout episode. When we were breaking this episode in the room, it was, Bo's up there with his whiteboard. He's like the lieutenant colonel. Tony is the general sitting there. Dan is like the admiral radioing in offshore from California. And I was probably like, I don't know, the second lieutenant or something. While we were breaking this episode, we were doing all the flashback chunks first, figuring what they were like. Tony came up with the idea that imagine Neeli happening, but you don't leave the chopper. All you can just hear is the sounds of it. And I was like, oh, that's a cool idea. And then the next one was like, you see them sort of getting on their feet, and then their relationship growing. And then all the beats for their wonderful flashbacks were sort of in place. But on Bo's whiteboard, it was just back to, the next beat was Clea continues her incursion into hospital. Well, when I got back home, I realized we didn't really break any of that. I had to just figure out, well, how the hell do you break into a Star Wars hospital? Has there ever been a Star Wars hospital portrayed? How does it function? How does it operate? And so Luke Hall and I had several long conversations about what it could be like. And the things that I think I was proudest of that survived was, her stealing a nurse's uniform. I figured that had had to be an important thing. So she has this little code scrambler that she unlocks the locker with. And the other one, the idea that I think was probably the best idea I had in this whole season was using a senile alien to sneak past the outer layer of defense. I was so happy that they stayed in, and I was so happy the way it was pulled off.
It was perfect for her to have a patient to wheel around because it made her seem more official and a part of the environment. So it worked great.
And then, sneaking up to the surgery door. And I think the biggest gift of that sequence is I argued pretty forcefully that we knew we were going to show them have their first act of terrorism, Clea and Luthen together. And I argued it should be on Naboo because that's the Emperor's home planet. And if Luthen is going to make his first public statement, I think he's going to stick his thumb into the eye of the guy he hates more than anyone. So when Tony heard my reasoning, he's like, I like that. Let's do that. So it's on Naboo. It's their first act of terrorism. And it ends with Luthen blowing up this bridge and them walking away. Basically, the first thing he taught her how to be an insurgent, right? So when I come back to the hospital scene, I'd already got her up to the top floor. And I remember thinking, well, how the hell do I get her to Luthen's room now? How do I? And then I thought, oh gosh, the first thing he taught her is going to be the last trick she uses to help him. And going from that detonation of that bridge to her blowing up all the speeders out on the parking ramps, that was never talked about in the room. That was something that came to me when I was puzzling this out. And I think it works really beautifully insofar as terrorism can be made beautiful. But I love just the echo of the first thing he taught her being the last thing she needed to give him. And, and you realize on a rewatch that she planted all those bomb slap charges on her way into the hospital and then sort of slipped in with a pretend hurt hand. I was really, really proud of that sequence. And, Elizabeth plays it so beautifully and Alonso shot it so well. And, Tony's ads are throughout. I just think it's a really beautifully made episode of television. So I'm really, really happy with how it turned out.
It was great because Clea has really come into her own this season. We've seen her really running the show for Luthen when she needs to. And it was great to see those flashbacks. They were definitely unexpected. So
it's weird. It's weird to do that on a 10th episode of a show.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about that in the room. Is this weird? It becomes a weird kind of a bottle episode. And I think a really interesting way. It's just all about them.
And that's why it works. I mean, because again, character writing. We've always dug Clea, but now we get to learn more about her. So it's like you've settled everyone down because you've seen her in action. And now we really want to know, how does she tick? I thought that was beautiful. I loved, Cassian sitting around with Melshi and K2 and they're playing a card game that's like poker. I'm a poker fan. I have the Cardamundi Star Wars poker chip set, which is the one time they allowed poker chips to be made in the Star Wars universe. What would you say the name of the game is that they're playing?
I had them playing Sabacc. And I actually bothered to learn the rules of Sabacc.
So they were playing Sabacc.
In my draft, Tony changed it to that game the guys are playing in the Aldani, Hexa or something. Again, he wanted to add it to the toy box. So Star Wars has a new game of chance. And I wasted, 2 hours learning how Sabacc actually functioned. But
Sabacc is not easy to learn, by the way.
It doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, but, I've tried to play it and it's not easy. I have a deck. Yeah. The deck looks cool. But so that's what the game was. I wanted to clarify that. Was there ever anything going to be more about the Calcite and the stuff on Gorman and everything that was being mined, or even show us the spiders? I was always wondering if we were going to see the spiders, and because we're in the spoilers section, when the minute they started talking about mining and even strip mining down on Gorman, I was wondering, were you guys going to have a big finale in a mine? And it never happened. And by the way, kudos to you.
The original conception of the heist at the end of episode 6, and I know Bo talked about this a little bit, it was much more elaborate and it involved much more. There was trains and travel between Webberies in the middle of town. It sounded great on paper, but you see how many swings this show takes. It cannot take unlimited swings. This is going to be a heist on a massive scale. And I think, they just had to call some shots. And I love the way 6 wound up ending, the quiet sort of le carre desperation of it, I think is very effective, especially going up to the powder keg that is episode 7, 8, and 9. Yeah. And so, the decision was made that however cool a possible Webbery visit, on a speeding train getting away from Imperial pursuers, that could have been very cool, but as Tony would put it, that wasn't protein. That would have been a sugar high. And I think it was the right call ultimately because, when you're in the deep, dirty business of getting a show of the scale on the air, you really have to pick where you're going to allocate massive amounts of resources because you cannot do that 5 times in a show of 12 episodes.
The death of Lonnie Young.
My favorite character, by the way.
Yeah, it was interesting because there's this thing that I talked about in our previous Andor episodes in which really it's Rogue One that is one of the first times you see a rebel kill another rebel, you know, because Cassian, he thinks that guy is going to draw too much attention or is unfit to escape, and he just kills him. And that's a
Can we
tone
talk about this?
changer. Yeah, and I want to talk about this because I also want to hear it as applied to Lonnie and Luthen killing Lonnie after Lonnie has just told him the most important information that the Rebel Alliance needs, which is there is a super weapon that is really being built.
The original conception is how the information reached Luthen. I may be misremembering this. I don't know. But I remember there being some hesitation for it to be Lonnie, to doing the telling. And I think a couple of us were like, well, why shouldn't it be Lonnie? And I think we realized pretty quickly that it is Lonnie and the clock is ticking and we want this to happen as fast as it needs to. Well, then Lonnie is not long for this world. And the thing as a dramatist I love about Andor and as a student of history, if I may be so grand, is that Lonnie is probably the single most heroic person in the Star Wars universe. And he shot and left effectively in a ditch with his daughter and wife cowering in some hidey hole in Coruscant. I cannot imagine a more tragic ending. My daughter cried when she realized that Lonnie had been killed. My daughter, whose name is Mina, and Tony, the gentleman he is, named Mina Rao after her. I just wanted to get that in there. My daughter cried and she couldn't understand why I killed Lonnie, who she liked so much. And I felt bad about it. I think Lonnie is such a great, fascinating character. But the fact of the matter is that, as Bo said, we constantly talked about all these characters from Andor. They're the gravel that the freeway of the royal family was built over. Yeah. And these are anonymous people who toiled heroically with no anticipation of recognition or even survival, and they all get steamrolled and they all get forgotten. All the OG original gangsters, as Tony often calls them, their names are lost to history. And how many revolutions can you say that? Probably most of them.
Yeah.
You know, the guy that really did what Paul Revere did, his name was Ezekiel Bissell, my last name. He's the guy that did all that shit, and nobody knows his name. People know Paul Revere's name for some historical quirk. I don't know. This is the way war and history and tragedy and conflict works. The people who should be remembered are not, and the people who are remembered shouldn't be, and just names are lost. And, you know, I don't know why Lonnie was shot by Luthen there. Like, I think Luthen probably felt he had no choice. And I also think this is where Luthen's moral compass, it's the equivalent of standing on the North Magnetic Pole. His compass is just going in a circle. He knows he's trapped. He knows they're coming for him. And I think it's like either Lonnie dies now or we potentially lose everything. And when I have the single most important piece of information in the galaxy. And so that's how I explained it to my daughter. But I will say that scene of Lonnie left there dead was, and Tony like really rode me on that. I had a much different version of that scene the first time I wrote it.
Which was what?
You saw them go into an elevator together, and I left it mostly implied. Like they have the conversation about what's important, and then Luthen's like, well, come with me. I'll get you out. And then he takes him into an elevator. And when the elevator opens, Luthen walks out, and you just see Lonnie's boot come on, and the door is closing on his foot. Tony didn't even want anything that like directed. Right. He wanted the gristle of it. He didn't want it to be abstracted. He wanted to show you this guy with a smoking bullet hole in his chest, left on a bench. Not because we dislike Lonnie. We love Lonnie. And I grieve for Lonnie. I look forward to the fan talks about Lonnie Young, the unsung hero of the Rebel Alliance, because he is.
You were talking about his wife and kid, and sure, that was going to be tough for Luthen to logistically coordinate their escape. But at the same time, by shooting him, which, by the way, I think is pretty harsh for a guy that just gave the Rebel Alliance their most important piece of information and has been a perfect spy within the organization.
Luthen is a good guy, but he's not a good man.
Right.
That's how I would put it.
But it's interesting because since Lonnie is killed, it actually looks like he was targeted by the Rebel Alliance, which should make some of the shadow that could have been hanging over him as a spy disappear, which means in another world, his wife and kid are probably okay.
You're forgetting that he logged into Deborah's account through his computer.
There is that.
So they busted him. They busted him right away. Yeah.
And we're going to get to that, but he was just snooping on his boss to see what was up. They don't know exactly what that information has come to, although they're guessing that Luthen has it for sure, because they know that Lonnie has seen it. In my heart of hearts, I hope his wife and kid are fine, but Lonnie could have been a great asset to the Alliance. Hear that, kids? When you're doing a revolution, try and keep your fellow revolutionaries alive, because somebody with ISB experience might be helpful in the revolution. One would think.
He would have been very helpful.
I think he would have been. But so it's interesting because here we're talking about the breadcrumbs that they're given. They're given Galen Erso's name. They're given, Kyber's disappearing from Jeddah. They're given little morsels and things to follow. How much information did you guys decide on? Because I think that would be tough, but you need to set things in motion so that we could get into them in Rogue One. And you gave just enough, literally, so that it could go from Luthen to Clea to Cassian.
Well, this is the brilliance of making Luthen sort of on the outs of the newly formed Rebel Alliance. His sources, his information is not trusted. Like they think he's gone off the pier. He's become a madman, and maybe he has. But I watched all the briefing scenes in the beginning of Rogue One obsessively. And, the most important part of it is that when Tivik says Urso, Cassian's heard that name before. So the weapon doesn't surprise him. He mentioned they're building some weapon, and he's just listening. It's when he says the name Urso that Cassian realizes that the threads he's been pulling are now like forming a Death Star shaped sweater, like all these threads are coming together. And so I remember us in the room just watching that opening of Rogue One and just like noting stuff like, okay, what do they know? What don't they know? And Draven in Rogue One is still resistant. He's still not trusting of this information. So Draven cannot be completely won over by the end of this episode. He cannot be convinced because in Rogue One, he's not yet convinced. So it was this really weird balancing act of these rogue characters and taking them to a place that was dramatically satisfying, but that also didn't ruin their characterization in Rogue. That was surprisingly tricky.
I would think so, but it's interesting because you again put in a line that make things bulletproof, and it could have been something Tony added, because I know he rewrote all your scripts, as he did with everyone's scripts, because he was the last person on board. But Draven actually says, if this is a trap, they're threading it perfectly.
Brilliant way to spring. That's a Gilroy-Tom combo. I did a version of it, and then he did a version of it. But that line was that was written out of my recognition that Draven is not sold yet, and he cannot be sold. And then I think,
but he's suspicious enough to send Cassian to check it out.
Yeah.
I guess that brings us to: did you ever script more about Luthen falling out with the folks on Yavin 4? Because, he's fallen out so much that Clea doesn't even feel comfortable there, which is weird because, as Cassian reminds them, they wouldn't really exactly be there in that spot if it wasn't for Luthen. When you have a show where a year is dropping in between each batch of 3 episodes, a lot can happen in that year, and clearly something went off between Luthen and the command structure. Did you guys ever map that out, or did you just want it to be a thread?
It's there, but you have to watch carefully. He freaks the shit out of Mon Mothma. He irritates Cassian. He's getting more and more careless, and the risks he's willing to take and the lives he's willing to burn, however brightly they burn, are becoming less and less reasonable to people who are now having some experience with insurgency. He shows up Bale Organa. He basically Bigfoots Bale Organa's rescue team. I'm glad he did, obviously, because Mom Mothman never would have gotten otherwise. But, all of the little seeds are there for the vibe you find in the last block, is that all these people have reason to distrust and not take anything Luthen says at face value. So there was never any plan to do a big scene of it. We're hoping that by seeing the places that Luthen is pushing these other people to and their rejection of him, by the time you come back in episode 11 to realize just how distrusted Luthen is. And I want to talk about Bale Organa. We were trying to figure how to make a foregone conclusion interesting. And that was my challenge on episode 12. We know he's going to see Tivik. How do we make this interesting? And I think it was Bo that was just basically, what if Bale Organa is completely dead set opposed to it? And I thought, okay, that's interesting. This beloved character, he becomes Cassian's antagonist in that last episode. And I think for the, hardcore Star Wars fan, the novelty of that emotional relationship was going to be interesting enough to sort of pull you through and kind of make you forget that that he gets on his ship and goes and sees Tivik. So that was a gift, that Bale becomes the bad guy for this scene. Not bad guy in a moral sense, but bad guy in a, characterological sense. That was just a really helpful breakthrough, I think. And once I realized that I was going to get to write a version of Bale where he's kind of a petulant dick, and I was really happy about that, because I was like, now I'm less worried about making the foregone seem interesting.
Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine. We turned 13 this year, and we couldn't have done it without you. Heck, it's even my 20th year of podcasting. So many different anniversaries. But look, if you've never read us before, you could check out our free issue on a desktop or laptop right over at backstory.net. Or you could check out our iPad app Backstory. We always update each of our digital issues as we continue getting closer to publishing our next issues. That's the phase that we're in right now. And after you read the free issue to test drive us, if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see Tom and I have a delightful discussion today on our YouTube page. It would really mean a lot to me to have you support independent entertainment journalism, so thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our interview with screenwriter Tom Bissell about Andor Season 2, Episodes 10 through 12, which you could watch right now on Disney+. It's always fun to hear left turns, things that were scripted but never shot. In our episode from last week, Dan Gilroy talked about, K2SO having his own standalone episode where it was almost like Alien. He was hunting everybody on a ship until they could capture him. That was fascinating, but he fully admitted that as much time as he spent on it, it didn't fit. What's something else like that would affect either the season or these 3 episodes that you remember that was just kind of a big idea that would have been fun, but just even though it was explored, it was never executed?
That's the one that stands out to me,
okay.
too. And I remember when he came in, we were all trying to figure out, how did K2 and Cassian meet? I looked at the comic, I think as homework. I went and looked to see if there's anything salvageable there, and there was nothing there. So we all got homework to go and just figure out something. And I don't think I even got my version out when Dan just started telling the story of Cassian and Melshi and Vel on this freighter that they're moving stuff and they're boarded. They kill the guards, but there's this rogue cake. It was like a 20-minute long narrated sequence. It was one of the most spellbinding stories I had ever heard anyone tell. And I think Tony just started clapping afterwards. But, it was a bottle episode. Here's the problem with Star Wars. There can be no bottle episode because most bottle episodes are there to save money. You're using an existing set and just shooting on it cheaply. Well, in Star Wars, you have to build the bottle, and the bottle has to be designed and worked on by 500 different people. There is no such thing as a bottle episode in Star Wars because it doesn't save you any money. In fact, it just costs more. And as much as we all wanted to do that sequence, I think one of the characters was going to have their arms ripped off. It was bananas. It was just hard to figure out where to put it.
Well, you alluded to it earlier. I mean, even the Miley massacre, that Clea is a victim of, that Luthen saves her from, it's all done from just a very small claustrophobic part of a spaceship, and you never see outside. You see dust blowing in, you hear screaming. It was very smart, and it was a way to save money. But you're right, constructing a whole ship and having this big action scene with K2, it just wouldn't work because you would have allocated too much of your budget to something that only has a one-time use. So I get that. That makes sense.
There were several more Clea Luthen flashbacks that I'm kind of sad we didn't get. One was the first time he found the Fondor. Basically, him buying the Fondor and Clea sort of exploring it, and they had a really lovely little moment there. And then the first time they visited the shop, the antique shop, and there was a Coruscant real estate agent named Shani showing them around. And by this point, their father-daughter bond is super solidified. And that was going to be the last piece of their flashback, this scene of them realizing, we're going to make our home here. This is where it's all going to really start.
And that was cut just for timing, I would assume.
It's hard to go back to the flashback structure after their boom boom on Naboo. And then you're into her approaching him.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, where do you put another flashback? And here's what happened. Because we lost so many pieces of the hospital incursion, there was fewer room for flashbacks. And so we had to slide them around, and a couple ones that I was very fond of dropped out.
Is there one cool thing that you want to tell us about the hospital sequence that never got shot?
Yeah, there was going to be, she was just about to, she got her key card. She was going to go into the surgery door. You see her go through it. She's just about to get in, and she was going to get grabbed by a nurse. And it's like, Dr. So-and-so needs you right now. And she was going to have to go be a part of a surgery, like an impromptu surgery thing. I think it got pretty far draft wise, just the absolute horror of someone going to kill their mentor and father figure. And then being pulled into this room with this squiggly alien, and you're cutting and blood squirting. I think there was just a concern that as funny and horrifying as it could have been, it just could have been a tonal grenade rolled into the sequence.
Obviously, I want to get to Dedra. She has a fatal flaw that we're grateful for because she got knocked out of the mix books, which she deserves to be, in which she just wouldn't give up on her investigation. Her promotion to handle Gorman really meant that that previous investigation where she was chasing whatever was going to lead to Luthen, yeah, it's important for sure, because it was a way to try and dismantle the rebels. But at the same time, her career didn't need it. The Gorman promotion was more than enough, but she wouldn't give up on it. And she had started accessing information inside the ISB, and she had accessed the Death Star information by accident, which, by the way, thank God she did, because that leads to Lonnie being able to see it and report it. When did you tie those pieces together? Because it's very complicated, and it's actually a character flaw that alerted the Rebel Alliance to all this. And although it cost Luthen his life because she finally was able to catch up with him on her investigation, it also lost her job and landed her in prison, possibly even the same prison that Cassian was once in.
Tony is the poet of bureaucracy, right? He really is. And I was trying to figure out, because we knew Lonnie had read Dedra's files. Okay, but then we were like, well, how the hell does Dedra have this stuff? This is like, she shouldn't have this stuff. And I think we were having a conversation. This is all much more believable now that I know the Atlantic Monthly's editor was put on a Signal group chat with the Trump administration, that like Tony just suggested maybe she had just a bunch of files forwarded to her. And so I kind of went in and started looking at like, what are these government files actually, like readouts, like the working groups, the readouts. This is all straight CIA language that I pulled from some of my own reading that I've done, that I was just trying to figure out how intelligence bureaucrats talk about their daily lives, the orbital process reports. Like, what would the language of someone building a station like the Death Star while not announcing it's the Death Star, what would it sound like? So I wrote a run of that. Tony's pretty happy with it, but we were stuck with like, how did she find Luthen? And I came up with this idea that Krennic's people had tortured to death years ago someone who could have blown the whole thing open had they just showed a little more restraint. Yeah. And that she stumbled across that piece, a local moth, the valet. I had him as a bodyguard, and Tony changed it to a valet or a chauffeur, I think, which is so much better, or a local moth. You know, you learn it for the fact, but that was the first domino that led her right to Luthen's shop door. She has a big, long speech there, right, where she's justifying her being a scavenger up against one of the most intimidating men in the entire Star Wars universe.
And you're talking about a scavenger of intelligence, which is, a fun term for once, because we know scavengers in other ways in Star Wars, so that was cool.
You know, that was Tony informing me taking a whack at it, and then him putting the final layer of lacquer on it. But I'm thrilled with how the Krennic Dedra confrontation worked out. I mean, I just think it's a chilling, awesome scene, seeing her put in her place like that thing where he puts his finger on her head. That was all found in performance. That was nothing that was in the script. And Tony talks about how scenes in the show are sometimes shaggy, right? And you worry on the page, they're wonderfully written and they're fun, but you worry like, is this just going to be a big energy drop? But man, like the directors of the show were able to just find things to just like pump those moments full of adrenaline at crucial waypoints so they don't feel like they drag, even though they're pretty talky scenes by the standards of like action adventure IP television. Certainly, that's the magic of the show. When you have world-class performers and characters whose behavior means something, your viewers hang in there. The audience pays attention.
But it's again the importance of character writing, as we talked about earlier. I mean, you have somebody seated and you have somebody standing, and people forget that you could have some of the most dramatic scenes ever that way. That's theater. That's the basics. So
exactly.
I mean, like it was a great scene, and of course the acting and the direction was on fire, but so was the writing. I mean, the things that they were talking about, because we, the audience, are kind of ahead of Dedra to begin with, because we know where these things are leading, because we're getting very close to Rogue One. For her to realize, as he says, just say the word, and she realizes, oh, I'm not in trouble because I went off the grid. I'm in trouble because I saw the Death Star in a document. You know, even though the Death Star is ready to go operational, her career is done. She's sunk, and she's going to end up in jail. That was really wild. And that brings me inversely to Leo, to Partagas, in which he knows that his number 2 is going down. He has self-preservation. He is sweating the extraction of Klaya. And, the scene of K2 coming in and saving them, it still gets a little bit of what I'm sure was in Dan's original, story on the ship. And it was great.
Robot rampage. Yeah.
Robot rampage, which was great. And, him walking around with a body that he's holding up, and they're shooting at their own, slain officer as K2's shield was wild. But it's wild because Leo is really trying to stop them from escaping. And you could see him sweating in that sequence where he's with the other people that are tracking it on their computer screens. And then he's done. And the one thing that threw me for a loop was to have him listen to a recording of the moment in season 1 when they're talking about rebellion, and just knowing that the tape of that dictated, explanation of revolution has made it so far into the further reaches of the galaxy. Of course, the ISB has a copy of it, and he's sitting there analyzing it, wondering, how do you even stop this?
I love that moment. That was a Tony. Like, he said that in the room. He just had this image of a camera pushing down the ISB white hallways in this final stretch, and you hear Nemec's voice. And in my original draft, that's a scene between Partagaz and Krennic, and it ended with Partagaz being arrested. Tony, he needed Krennic off the chessboard, and he, has instead Legret come in, and instead of an arrest, I love that change. I love the change that Partagaz blows his own head off at the end of that sequence, and just that little move of Legret holding his hand up at the stormtroopers, like weirdly moving, even though I don't like any of these people. It's just like when I see Dedra and Narkina at the end, like,
right.
I get emotional every time I see her plunge her face into her hands, because Marcus Aurelius, my favorite philosopher, says the best revenge is to not be like your enemies, and to still feel human empathy for people suffering. Doesn't matter if they're horrible people that have made other people suffer. It's no fun to watch even monsters suffer if you're a well-adjusted person. And that's another thing I like about the show, is that the show still has empathy for Dedra at the end, even though she has none for anyone.
Well, and fascinatingly, she gives them the final hint to even close in on Clea.
Yes.
In which she says, use some of the old broadcasting waves, the pulse signals. Like, the stuff that she was saying about that led them exactly there, but she gets no reward. She's still in jail. Yeah. That was fascinating as well. I mean,
another character left in a ditch, Jeff.
Yep.
That's the ongoing thing. Cassian, for all intents and purposes, is left in a ditch.
Yeah,
they all are.
I mean, it's interesting because Will, Bix, and Clea are really the three that we know that live, that kind of came out of this series. Was there anything else that you were going to do with that? Because the reveal of Bix having a child was a really interesting way to end, and I'm curious where you guys kind of ran down that path. And I easily also could have seen Will on the extraction scene, but we know that he's on Yavin.
We wanted some people to survive, just to provide some glimmer of hope at the end of this thing. And I think Tony wanted to throw some rope into the water for Lucasfilm, like that he wanted people from the Andor verse to have made it out, if there's, because if there's ever a use for them in the future. Doing what we called that last montage, we called it the Wheel of Fate. And we talked a lot about who should be in it and how and what they were doing. Perrin, I hope that becomes a gif of him just, braving the mid-afternoon hangover with
Skulden's wife.
The mother-in-law of his daughter. Yeah, I didn't have it as Skulden's wife. I had it as some sort of humanoid alien lady. I love that it's Skulden's wife.
I was dying at that. That was really funny.
Saw on Jeddah, Wilman just with Drina having a normal life, Mon and Vel, being who they are. I think I originally pitched Mon in her hut, looking at one of her beautiful dresses from Chandrila or from the Imperial Senate, and sort of feeling it. And I think that just didn't fly for any number of reasons, but it wasn't who Mon was anymore. I don't think she missed the opulence. And I think that was Tony's point in pushing back against that. It's like, she doesn't miss the finery. So why are we implying that she does? And I was like, yeah, that's probably
well,
true.
Yeah. I mean, I believe Dan in his episode talked about there was a scene where when they were escaping, that Cassian and Mon stop by Chandrila, and she has a big chat with Perrin about how he has to raise their daughter and she's no longer going to be there. And on that one, again, he said I
got something to add. That was going to be a really interesting moment. Tony performed it, of Perrin just saying, I knew what you were up to this whole time. They talked to me every week. They would interrogate me. I never said a word. You didn't trust me. You could have trusted me. And the heartbreak she would feel in that moment of this guy that she'd pushed out could have been reliable. And just the double heartbreak of her walking away from, her life, and thinking that she's dropping this deadbeat husband who never supported her. And then the double dagger stab of but that's not headcanon. That didn't happen.
Right.
So the Perrin we see drinking Revnog in the speeder with Davos Skulden's wife, that's not the guy in the show.
That's not the trustworthy guy that was pitched. And I think it was good that she didn't trust him, because for the show itself, he wasn't. But that would have been a great reveal. So thank you so much for telling us that, because that would have been amazing. I want to ask you about your toughest scene. What was the scene that you found yourself coming back to over and over again, rewriting, or a late night phone call from Tony saying, hey, I want you to go back to school on this scene. I want you to take another crack?
I tried to write a monologue for Mon that basically gets everyone's act together to let Cassian go see this guy Tivik. and I wrote multiple versions of her plea. And Tony did a pass of one of them, and I think at some point it was just like, no, she sends Vel to spy on that scene where Vel visits Cassian was always there, where they drink to the OGs who
Yeah.
are no longer with us. Tony's ad was to basically have Mon Mothma ask Vel to like spy on him to help me believe him. And then all of the effort that we put into Mon's big plea, because Mon wouldn't be making the plea. Bale would be making the plea. And so, God, the number of hours I spent doing this Mon Mothma monologue just turned into Draven and Mon saying to Bale, hear us out, much more elegant. And then the cut to Cassian waking up in the morning. Because again, why expend all those calories on something you know is going to happen? I think my favorite contribution of episode 12 was May the Force be with you, Captain. And I was worried Tony was going to push back against it. It's like the second to last thing anyone says in the show, but I was really happy when he was all for it because it's where it goes.
It was great. And, you mentioned him waking up. He's waking up from a dream about his sister.
That was John Gilroy ad. That was not in any script I saw. John, I think, beautifully plopped that in. And my God, it makes me look like a genius. But that was a John Gilroy creation.
I mean, I had talked to Tony about it, whether it was going to be an element that was carried over from season 1. And he said if he finds her, he might lose his gumption to keep saving people. And by not finding her, he's always spun that way. Was there ever any mention in your Bible episodes or, the breaking of season 2 that he was going to be reunited with his sister or anything like that?
We spent a couple hours talking about multiple ways to resolve this thread, and none of them really rose to the level of our collective interest. They all seemed mawkish or misdirected or too convenient and just not really what the show is about.
Yeah.
The show is not about whether he finds his sister. The show is about a guy who was traumatized into action by an agglomeration of injustice that moves him to go out and care about other people. Not everyone's loose ends get tied up. And just because a character wants something doesn't mean they ever get it. I don't know if this was a John or a Tony ad. I've never talked to Tony about this, but that shot of his sister right before he wakes up, before the last day of his life, effectively, moi. It's a beautifully subtle way of resolving his quest,
Absolutely. Is there anything you're working on next that you want to tell us about that's coming up?
Nothing I'm allowed to talk about. Hopefully you'll hear from old Tommy B again one of these days.
You know what? I want to hear whatever you're doing. You're invited back into the podcast or Backstory Magazine anytime you have something going on. But look, Tom, it was great to have this chat about Andor Season 2. You really nailed it in those final 3 episodes. I think fans are going to be very happy with them. So thank you so much for your time and coming down to chat today.
My absolute pleasure. I'm a fan, so I appreciate it.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to screenwriter Tom Bissell for being so generous with his time and coming down to chat about Andor Season 2, episodes 10 through 12, which you could watch right now on Disney+. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. It's my 13th year of publishing Backstory. It's my 20th year of podcasting, so plenty of anniversaries and reasons to celebrate. If you've never read us before, you could read an entire free issue over at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could watch all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see Tom and I chatting about today's episode right on YouTube. It would really mean a lot to me to have you support independent entertainment journalism, so thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2025. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to drop me a line, I'm pretty easy to reach. You could find me as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag on Blue Sky, or you could find me as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag on Twitter, or you could find me as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag on Instagram. Do you see a trend here? I also have a Facebook fan page you could reach out to me on, and of course, you could always go old school and write an email to backstoryletters@gmail.com, and I will do my darndest to respond to you. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.